we're going to prepare somebody for self-defense, and when I say self-defense, I don't mean, in a bar, guys get, I mean a bad situation because someone's coming to do you real harm and such. If they just want to rob you, then you give them the money and whatever, if they have a weapon or something. So on that, I just want to bring up a couple points that I think people are missing when they're talking about real self-defense. And the first one is that we should look at the worst case scenario. When we do jiu-jitsu, often some of the first things we learn is mount escape, because that's a really bad situation. When we transfer our jiu-jitsu into an MMA realm environment, again, context changes. Now our hand positioning has to be a little, say we're doing guard bottom now. Hand position has to be a little different, because if I just dig for an underhook, they're going to drop an elbow over the top. So we have to be checking the elbows and making sure we're in a position where we can't get hit with the elbow. When we transfer and go another step, we say, hey, self-defense, the most dangerous thing can happen is that somebody pulls out a pistol or a knife on you. So that's where we change hand positions again, and we change our focus to always assume that there's a weapon involved, and then not just know that that's the case, because a lot of people, I know that they'll train for self-defense. We're talking people that are training, they're law enforcement, maybe military, or whatever it is. What they want is self-defense. And they say, okay, we're going to train, and I know a weapon could come out. But as we know, if we don't train it, it's in our sparring, in our rolling, then we're not going to actually be ingraining the motions or ingraining the positions, ingraining the focus to always look for that motion. Oh, they're drawing something, or they're going here, they're drawing. So that's because I know you wanted to hear a little bit about the self-defense. I think that's the main thing that I've really added to the self-defense, straight self-defense realm, is that anytime we're kickboxing, clinch, or ground, or scenario, that's the thing. Self-defense, there's also scenario that we don't have in MMA, is that as we're doing this, we're always monitoring the hands visually from kickboxing range. In the clinch, we should really try to use it visual, but we want tactile also. We want to be grabbing, that's why double bicep tie, man, that is so good for self-defense. Against somebody much bigger and stronger, that double bicep tie still works. They struggle to get their arm out of there, and you duck to the back, and
you're
just
controlling
a really good thing.
Space.
Yeah. So that I just wanted to bring that up. My whole emphasis on self-defense. Oh, I do have a BJJ for the Street program that I think people would find very interesting, because it's all about what happens when there is weapons in the environment. What happens when someone's going to, okay, vale tudo, we had punching, elbows, headbutts. Then we add weapons. The possibility, there's a likelihood that they're going to bite you, so you have to be aware of that, and a lot of different things. Sure. But it's really jiu-jitsu based.
Sure.
But
send me all those URLs, and we'll make sure we put them in at the bottom here in the notes so people can check that out.
Okay.
We've had some products like that too. Paul Sharp in particular has put some stuff out. He has a new video out. It's actually with BJJ Fanatics. It's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for self-defense.
Awesome.
And it does come back exactly to what you're talking about, which is controlling the hands. One thing he talks about, and Paul and I have talked about this quite a bit, is, one of the things we try and do at the gym is you're right. I think the vast majority of people that sign up don't sign up because they want to compete in a jiu-jitsu tournament or they want to fight MMA. They sign up for self-defense.
Right.
They'll take confidence, get in shape, but deep down, I think really what they want to do is they want to be able to not be in a situation, be able to defend themselves in a situation like you described.
Right.
And the tools are there. All the tools to be able to defend yourself in those situations are there, as is the appropriate training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and in the clinch, as you know. They're all going to come down to the same fundamental clinch positions that you'd see in Greco or Muay Thai. But what gets lost, I think, is the focus. And just reminding students, like when our students first come to the gym and go through the introduction classes, the intro classes for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, every class that the conversation of self-defense is brought up. The context of self-defense is brought up. Because what I don't want to have happen, is I don't want to have, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, you'll have a blue belt or a purple belt he has some MMA training, or she has some MMA training, she's talented on the ground. And because maybe they don't actually realize what they can do because they're constantly playing game versus game, jiu-jitsu versus jiu-jitsu, or MMA versus MMA, they're going up against other skilled fighters. They would think, oh, I need to go take a Krav Maga class to get some self-defense, And in reality is you can take them and work the material I'm sure you're talking about, or what we talk about with Paul, or controlling the hands, controlling the inside space. And they can pick it up like that. And they can pick it up like that because he or she has 5 or 6 or 7 years training in that delivery system. And it just involves a little touch of dirt, Whereas the flip side of that is somebody that gets so hung up on this is street and this is sport, they never really take the time to develop the solid skill in the delivery system. So they would not be capable of competing against another blue belt or purple belt because their whole focus is on the street. Right. And they may have the techniques, but the actual skill set of the delivery system, the movement, the ability to put their body where they need it to be against resisting opponents, that's gone, right? Because that comes only from the delivery system.
Absolutely. So I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I actually became a Krav Maga instructor.
Oh, okay. I actually didn't know that. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine because, again, it's the truth. But the guy I did it under, this guy near my mom, he actually is a real deal. He, after 9/11, when special forces from Canada and United States went to Israel to get training, he was one of the guys training these guys and all. So, he's a real deal. But the great majority of Krav Maga, they never add resistance.
Right.
Or if they do some kickboxing rounds. And there are some that, Nir showed me video of those guys in Israel training, and they were just like we used to train. Like we're talking about head trauma and such. But it's the same thing. They're like, oh, I know how to do this and this, and then they start doing the like gun disarms where you're going here and all this sort of thing. But the same thing, pressure testing. So what I did was I would learn all these different gun disarms from Nir and from other people as well. And then what do? I go to Egan and we go, okay, we're going to train. I said, hey, before we train, let's do this. Here, you take the gun, you point it at me, I'm going to try to take it away from you. So I do it, and no chance. Then a month later, I have another one I'm going to try. I've been practicing it, right? I go, doesn't work. And then finally, there was one that worked. And I remember when I did it, I did this, and he starts laughing. He goes, man, do that again. I'll see. Boom, I did it again, and it actually worked again. And then there's some things off it. So there's some really practical ones. Sure. But guess what? You have to have the feeling of dealing with a resisting person, because when the first one, they move and they naturally take it out of position, you have to flow to the next one and such. One thing different in self-defense, especially knife and gun defense, is sometimes you turn your back, especially knife, because if you're doing knife defense out there, one thing to think about, we want to control the knife, of course. Well, first of all, just to be clear, we don't want to be there. We want to give them what they want. We want to be out of there. But if you have to do it to protect someone, a loved one or whatever, you want to control the knife. Mm-hmm. So, we go, okay, control the knife. That means we're going to control the knife arm. Okay, well, you have to control the knife arm in a certain way, because if you do like the old outside 2-on-1, they're going to switch hands. So it's not actually controlling the knife. Mm-hmm. So what we have to do is control the knife in a way to make it difficult for them to switch hands. So I have 3 videos of actual stabbings where the defender ends up grabbing a hold of the arm. The other person switches hands immediately. Not trained people.
I have seen people occasionally move away from jiu-jitsu or de-emphasize jiu-jitsu and emphasize more street, quote unquote, training. And I'm not talking about Burton. I don't want anybody to draw that assumption, because I like Burton. I think he's on a good path. I'm talking about my own students in times past. Okay. I would see them veer away from jiu-jitsu and gravitate more towards, we want to train more functional street, and they'll focus more on clinch and stand-up. And part of, and I know you've seen this too, and we both recognize part of what's there. And part of what's there is the fact that it's impossible to hide your weaknesses in jiu-jitsu. Because if you're rolling for submission, right? Because you will get tapped. You're going to get tapped out. You're going to get held down. You're going to be dominated. And there's just no, well, I did pretty good, or I didn't. He got you. He got the choke or whatever. And that's part of what makes it so healthy. But, you can play clinch. You can pummel. You can even box and exchange blows with somebody who's a much better striker than you are, a much better grappler or clinch person than you are, and still make it appear like a game and protect your ego in a way that you can't with jiu-jitsu. And so I unfortunately, I see sometimes these guys gravitate more towards that, and the excuse they'll use is street. But in reality, it's just a way to avoid the rigid rod of truth, as Vunak would say, which is inevitable with jiu-jitsu. And that same, and I don't think that everybody does that, but I've seen people fall for that. But the same reason why people who are avoiding rolling and having to confront all the stuff that happens as you age or your athletes get younger or whatever when you're rolling, the same reasons clinch and stand-up doesn't force that same level of recognition on you is the same reasons why it's easy to insert all this other stuff that you're talking about. If you come in with a goofy lock or something like that and you try it in jiu-jitsu, the guy's just gonna, well, that's not gonna work.
Right.
But you can pretend to sneak who knows what in a stand-up play.
But you do, so you are seeing a similar, so that I would make this argument, you are seeing the same thing move its way back into jiu-jitsu.
Sure.
Because there are now plenty of schools who are just quote unquote self-defense schools,
right?
Which not always, but generally means that their students are not rolling in a free form manner where, it's you and me tap and we go to submission.
Mm-hmm.
And they're generally not competing, and they're generally not allowing outsiders in to roll with them.
Yes.
And I've seen this happen more and more. I've seen
one of those. Don't you have one of those schools in your area?
We do have one of those schools in our area, and I have never said a disparaging word about how they choose to train or their path, but they believe that what we are doing is not authentic.
Right.
That somehow, because sometimes we will grab a sleeve, somehow that is less authentic,
right,
than their students not knowing that sometimes someone will grab your sleeve and put a foot on your bicep.
Right.
That somehow my guy's doing an UPA perfectly, and I always tell my students, I didn't even know how to do the UPA until about 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow my students doing an UPA perfectly is different on the mat than it is on the street.
Right. Right. Isn't that crazy? That's an argument. I know you know this, but that one drives me crazy more than any other. I mean, the circumstances, all of a sudden, the gravity of the circumstances go way up, and now the need for aliveness becomes less. It's completely illogical.
Well, didn't you and Andy were just talking about this, how you fall to the level of your training.
Right.
And the more pressure put on you, the more you will fall to that.
Yeah.
So.
And you and I both know that, in particular in the case of what you're talking about, it's a way for them to avoid the reality of what happens when you're training combat sport.
It is also because they don't know how to get people good. Now, they might have someone who is good in their gym. I am not denying that one of these sports schools, one of these self-defense BJJ schools doesn't have a guy that could come over to my gym and give everyone a hard time.
Right.
But it is difficult to get everyone that comes into your gym better. And the only way to do that is through aliveness, is through proper drilling.
Right.
And because they don't know how to do that, it is easier just to insulate them from the outside say that we are doing the street here, we are doing self-defense,
Right.
and then roll in a very limited manner,
Mm-hmm.
and then keep everyone from coming in there. I remember Connolly telling me about one of his purple belts who traveled somewhere, and the first gym he called in the area, they said, we don't allow anyone to come over.
Right.
And I understand from a safety standpoint being careful about who comes over, but if someone tells me they train with their purple belt with Chris Connolly, I know that person knows how to train.
Right.
And they're welcome to come. But he was told to go somewhere else.
Yeah. You know what's interesting about what you're saying is a good example of this. And I'm not sure, to be honest with you, I'm not sure exactly why it happens. I fully recognize that I gave you the most nefarious answer. It's one of many options. I mean, the reason why I talked about it being a way for people to kind of protect their egos, because I was talking specifically about a couple students I've had in times past that I saw move away from the kind of training that I think is healthy and that we all do, and move more towards the street aspect of it. But in reality,
no, I'm not I'm agreeing. I'm saying they're doing it for the same reason on the ground.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I agree with you.
Like, you rarely see it. You don't see a 27-year-old head coach at a BJJ school who competes and rolls hard, touting, let's all train self-defense. It's always a guy who has gotten 45, 50 years old. Rolling with people is it is difficult as we get older to come to grips with what is really happening.
Right.
And most of our students, especially the ones that have been with us a long time, they're better than us.
Yeah, should be.
Because there is no sport on the planet where a guy at 45 is better than a guy at 25.
Right.
It just doesn't happen. So I agree.
Jiu-jitsu, we can keep up a lot better than we can just about any other sport.
We can keep up. We just have to change our outlook. When we were 25, the outlook was, I'm going to tap that guy every 30 seconds, every minute, or whatever, like just our egos.
Yeah.
And when we're 45, sometimes with a 25-year-old purple belt, it's just being able to do good fundamental jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, and survive and roll another
Survive, defend, roll another day, make them work, be a good training partner.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's tough. It is a lot easier to just say, okay, we focus on the street.
No, 100%. And, we see that. But there's another piece, too, as well. I mean, that's why I was saying I think there are multiple reasons. So I'll run this one by you. And I don't know the answer for this. But Hickson, for example, has made some, I think, valuable and true, worthwhile and reasonable criticisms of IBJJF and the nature of how jiu-jitsu has changed in the 20-30 years since he started teaching here in the States. And having witnessed that evolution, I understand what he's talking about. I feel like I understand what he's talking about, having talked to him about it, and agree with him. So when I started jiu-jitsu in the 90s, it was very much about fighting. Not the self-defense like somebody's going to put you in a wrist lock or something, what do you do with a drunk guy in the street? There was that, but it was about fighting. Everything we were doing was related to Vale Tudo. The crossover to MMA that's what we were doing. We were doing MMA on the ground, basically. And there was always slaps. Haueter, when he first would come to Oregon, I don't think we ever rolled where he didn't hit me in the head at least once or twice. It was just part of what we did. Fighting was what jiu-jitsu was about. And then it hyper-specialized, and you have schools and people who are training specifically for the IBJJF rules. And in that, there's a fear that the really fearsome, awesome fighting art of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, will get lost. So I understand his point. The solution that he's advocated for it, and what I've seen as far as the self-defense tournament he has, is a kata. It's two guys that go out and do the self-defense techniques, some of which I like and some of which I don't. There are valuable, solid jiu-jitsu movements in the old Gracie self-defense system, and then there's ones that we both know we've made major improvements on. But that's not the point. What I'm talking about is a training method. They're literally working against a cooperating opponent the way you would in Aikido, and then you have a panel of judges who score them like you would kata. And actually, Haueter, Chris, refereed one of these matches, and while he's there, he's wondering, why do you need a referee? I don't understand why I have a referee. And so you have a legitimate problem that I think he's identified, but the solution to it is exactly what we should not do. It will destroy and kill the art.
At this mat room, they also had a karate club and a kung fu club. And sometimes I would have my class just before the karate club would start, and sometimes I had on this other day, and we had a chalkboard, and it could write, kung fu club meets here, Jethro's American Karate Club, which is what it was like, one of those classic American flaggy karate club guys.
Stars and Stripes type.
Yes, hard style karate.
Yeah.
And he was a cool guy.
Yeah.
He challenged me, and afterwards he was cool.
Yeah.
The kung fu guys were dicks.
Okay.
And they were, and this has nothing to do with religion, but they were very religious. So it was a cultish thing, and it was Islamic.
Islamic, okay.
And
an Islamic kung fu
yes,
school.
It was weird.
It's like Silat. No, just regular Chinese kung fu?
I don't even remember the name.
All right.
But after I beat the karate guy, and on the chalkboard, I would put, Brazilian Jiu-jitsu club, parentheses, Gracie style meets X time, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And I have my class.
Yeah.
And
this is after the challenge matches had come out in Playboy and stuff.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm a purple belt.
Right.
And I came in one day, and the Kung Fu guys wrote on there something like, never trust martial arts that wear white, antiquated karate suits and ranking systems. It was something that was clearly an insult, right?
Right.
And I wrote under it, why don't you come over to my class, like tomorrow or whenever it is, and we can spar.
Right.
And yes, they came.
How many came?
About 3 or 4 of them.
Okay.
And it was a little scary.
Okay.
And it was one of those things, these
bigger dudes.
They're dropping down in the splits, and they're doing all their stretches and their high kung fu kicks, where they hold their hand out and they do their kicks and their little twirl kicks. And I'm a purple belt, and I'm just thinking, God, I wish the Gracies or Machados were here.
Yeah.
And back in the old days as well, it's like, whether it was Horion or Hickson or Hegan and stuff, and I don't remember how they asked, but they basically asked you, are you a guy who will accept a challenge fight?
Right. And you were expecting.
And in your mind, it's like, oh yeah, I'm a guy who accepts. Okay, good. And then you realize, wait, did I just agree to let these guys put me in a pit fight?
Yeah.
It was weird, right?
Yeah.
But it was cool.
Yeah.
I mean, and it was way scarier than because MMA wasn't established. It was way scarier.
Yes. You still had the idea that strikes could break your.
Yes, and it was like, holy shit, this is scary. I could get punched in the neck.
Yeah.
But so the Kung Fu guys were there, and he's stretching around, and I'm like, okay, and I'm remembering all of the things I learned from in Horion's garage out of Hicks and all those guys. It's like, okay, we have to establish the ground rules first. When they come and they're practicing, and I quickly assessed the one that was there.
So you were saying you went over the rules with them. Was that something you learned from the?
Yes.
Okay.
And
they told you what did what they did.
No eye gouging and all this. And the way I would explain it is if I slap or I yell, I've had enough, and we will stop, right?
Yeah.
And he agreed.
Okay.
And I had my guys there, and he had his guys there. And at the same, I didn't want it to escalate into a gang fight.
Sure.
Right? I wanted to make sure it was me and him.
Yeah.
And then we got in that a brief argument about like his style. We allow eye gouges and all that, and groin grabs.
Right.
And I tried explaining. I mean, you realize that means I can grab your eyes as well.
Yeah.
And then an eye for an eye. Everyone's blind and all. Like I remember, I used that line. I convinced him that round one, we would use no eye gouges or groin grabs.
Yeah.
But everything else is allowed.
Okay.
And it was fucking scary.
Yeah.
It was really scary, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And the guy was fast, and he could kick really high.
Right.
And I did classic entry.
Stomp kick.
Yep, and it was scary. And I closed kind of awkwardly, I remember. It was not a great close.
Yeah.
I got hit a couple times,
Okay.
and I was mad.
Yeah.
Once we hit the mat, I was mad.
Yeah.
And scared,
Yeah.
which added more anger.
Yeah, so your adrenaline's going.
But because I don't have Horion and Hickson or Hegan watching me as a back, I feel like I'm fucking alone out here.
Right.
And I got to defend Gracie Jiu-Jitsu here.
Right.
And the pressure on me, I'm like, fuck, I got to defend this.
Right.
And I remember he started grabbing my skin, like just my adrenaline's pumping up because I remember this.
Right.
And I was really mad, and I grabbed him by his face, and I went, here's why we aren't allowing eye gouges. And I held it as if I could, and then I just bitch slapped him as hard as I could, and I stood up, and I went, let's we'll go again. Would you want to have no rules now? And he was like, no, let's have the rules. And we went one more time, and I choked him.
Yeah.
And
you
that
roll
was
belly
it.
down,
Yeah.
and you got
God, I get all fired up just remembering that because it was like one of those things. Like I was still on an adrenaline high at the end of the night. You know, going like, whew, that was fucking gnarly.
Yeah. People don't realize like now MMA is a sport, and a lot of people do it. Mm-hmm. And back then, when the first UFC came out, it was pretty intense, and people didn't really know what to think. And people had all these ideas about what would happen if you hit somebody with these strikes.
Yes, without gloves. It was.
But I already know. I think I and probably everybody that's watching this already knows the answer. But when you were put in a situation like that, what did you go back to?
Basic with jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, like a stomp kick entry,
yes,
body lock.
The stomp kick entry.
Mount.
Control their arms and hands. Stay on top.
Yeah.
If you're on bottom, have a closed, tight guard. Control their head and hands.
There you go.
And that's, old school jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. Works.
Yep. No A. Lahiva guards in back old school fights, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not that I don't love the De La Hiva guard, but
sure.
yeah.
So did any of the Kung Fu guys sign up with you?
No. And I was actually scared because I had one of my students who ran the Jeet Kune Club told me that the main instructor that wasn't the main instructor. It was his number one student, and that to be ready because now the main guy might fucking come. Then I was like, "Fuck, holy shit!" Now
I bet he never did though.
No, he didn't come.
Yeah,
he didn't come. And I heard he was tough, and was a heavyweight.
Yeah.
So I think also he didn't want to be the heavyweight who
lost to a grappler.
Or even it would look bad,
yeah.
Because I think I was only 148 pounds at the time. I mean, it would have been like, so no, he didn't come. The old days were like a whole other day.
Yeah.
A whole other era of this thing.
How old are you right now, if you don't mind me saying?
53.
53. I'm 51. You're 53. Most of them are younger. Some of them are a little bit older. But eventually, everybody's going to be here one way or another. Hopefully. What advice do you have for people doing jiu-jitsu in their 50s now? And what are your current objectives and goals with jiu-jitsu?
Right. So certain things never change. So if you're in your 20s, it's the same. Again. Believe in jiu-jitsu, really trust the technique. Even when it's not working, it's the right thing to do because it will work eventually. Like jiu-jitsu, like
more than you like winning, that will take care of 90% of your problems at 20 years old, 30 years old, 53 years old. And then, you know, I'm working a good amount of strength. I'm working a good amount of mobility. I'm you know, yoga when I can, breathing. There's always a tension between time and money, right? Time and money are limited, and so if at those points in my life when I have limited time and resources, I will focus on jiu-jitsu. But if you have a little extra time and or a little extra money, I think doing some external work on strength, mobility, breathing really pays a lot of dividends. And having said that, it's always important because I don't want to be misunderstood. None of my jiu-jitsu succeeds or fails because my bench press goes up or down. None of my jiu-jitsu succeeds or fails because I can do more yogic flexibility things. Those are about injury prevention and
right.
You know, structural stability in my body. But when I win, it's not because I'm stronger, and when I lose, it's not because I'm weaker. It always comes back to jiu-jitsu and being more technical, I think.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the breathing. Glenn's been focused a lot on that. You've been focused on that, and it seems to be a big part of jiu-jitsu, and it seems to go hand in hand so well, as we talked about, with a lot of Hickson's curriculum. Hickson's curriculum, like we were discussing last week, fits together so well in a way that jiu-jitsu, prior to seeing the full depth of the curriculum, I think what I felt like a lot of times is you have a little bit of guard from here and a little bit of half guard from here and a little bit of mount from here. But with Hickson stuff, the transfer of weight, the connection, the going from passing into the cross sides, the escaping, all of it meshes together so well. And yes. I can see at this point, though not understand directly, and certainly not teaching at this moment, where the breathing would fit in with the rhythm of how all that fits together. But how do you see it at this moment now, having spent some time thinking about it and working on it, where the breathing fits into that?
Right. So there's breathing as a solo drill or solo exercise, which is just becoming stronger and more efficient with the many muscles involved in breathing.
Right.
And then there's breathing while doing jiu-jitsu. I have not and really don't need to do what Hickson did with sort of deliberately manipulating his heart rate through breath and things for a real fight and trying to outlast someone in like a real fight. But in sparring, I simply focus on never breathing through my mouth, never breathing audibly. And if you can do those two things, your breathing will be regulated. If I can
keep your mouth closed while you're rolling.
Yeah, breathing through my nose, and then even through my nose, not, you know, my partner can't hear me breathe. My coach can't hear me breathe. I think that's a good. If I hear someone breathing,
mm-hmm.
When I'm rolling with them, or if I'm coaching, I know they're going too hard, and certainly when I hear them like grunting, which happens sometimes too, like they're trying to oop on, it's like, or they're trying to come out with an underhook from half guard bottom, and it's like, I just know their breath is all messed up at that point.
Yeah.
So yeah, just and trying to start and finish rolls with the same breath rate has been really helpful as well. And people will say, yeah, but I can't do that because, you know, he passed my guard. And it's like, well, then you're not worried about your breathing. You're worried about your guard. You know, it's about priorities.
Right.
Yeah.
Where would you prioritize breathing?
Well, so it depends on every role, but basically, you know, it's the most important in that I want to begin and end with it pretty much even. So it's important as kind of bookends to the role. But then once you have that and it becomes a habit, you can forget about it and prioritize other things.
Right.
if my breathing is going, I'd have to go back to it. If my breathing is, if I can maintain my breathing, then it is my priority, but I go consciously to other things, like, oh, do I want to work mount bottom today? Okay, I'll let people mount me and stuff. But if any time my breathing goes, I'd have to return to that, I think, as the most important thing.
I gravitated towards Jeet Kune Do because from what I saw in the martial arts magazines and the literature at the time, it seemed to be what we would later call mixed martial arts. And so from a pretty early age, my teenage years, I kind of knew that I needed to learn mixed martial arts. Didn't exist at the time, but I understood you had to be able to fight at all the different ranges. And the big thing about Jeet Kune Do was they would talk about having to fight at all the ranges. I never did understand, even back then, where the Filipino martial arts aspect of that fit into it, other than, okay, so you also want to be able to fight with edged and impact weapons. But I gravitated towards Jeet Kune Do. When I got out of the military, I trained with an instructor named Mike Packey, who was one of Paul Vunak's first instructors. And Paul Vunak's tapes had just come out, I think, in Panther Productions. And Paul's a pretty charismatic guy, and a lot of what he was doing, especially in those first tapes, made a lot of sense to me. It looked like MMA in many ways. So I trained every day with that guy for hours every day. That's all I did, because I was working at a job and just training. And that lasted for a while, I think a year and a half, almost 2 years. And then my job moved me up to Portland, Oregon. And so I drove up here to Portland, Oregon by myself in a car, and immediately started looking for another Jeet Kune Do school. There was none. There was nothing in the phone book. So I started putting out flyers to put together a training group. And the only reason I was going to start teaching Jeet Kune Do under the permission from my instructor in California was because I needed people to train with. And circumvent a long story, I ran into a few people. I ran into some students of Steve Golden, and Steve Golden was actually one of Bruce Lee's original students. And I did not like what they were doing. What they were doing was basically just Wing Chun. And the first thing I did when I got to Portland and realized there was no Jeet Kune Do schools was I signed up at a boxing gym called Grand Avenue Boxing Gym. So it was a legitimate pro amateur boxing gym. And I was boxing 5 days a week. So Monday through Friday for 3 hours a day after work, I was in the gym. And when I went and trained with these guys, these Steve Golden guys, I knew right away that they would have no answer if somebody were to throw even a single punch. So it was obvious to me they weren't doing something realistic. And eventually somebody answered my flyer who was an instructor under Dan Inosanto. And I went and met these two guys. One's name's John Daniel, and the other one's Chris Clark. John's still here in Portland and a friend of mine. And they were doing the very typical Jeet Kune Do concepts curriculum under Dan, which is they'd have Muay Thai, then they'd have what they call a Jun Fan class, which was more Bruce Lee's martial art. And then they'd have a lot of Kali, and then they'd have Silat, because Penjok Silat had become kind of the new magic bullet for Jeet Kune Do at that time. And I was super interested in the Muay Thai. I was interested in the Jun Fan to the degree that it resembled kickboxing, and I was interested in any grappling. So I started training together with them. Eventually, Chris opened up a school. I became kind of the main instructor for that school, and I was teaching the boxing and kickboxing. And on Friday nights, I got my own class. That was my class to do whatever I wanted with. And in that class, what I did is I had a core group of maybe 15 people, and we got random sports equipment, used sports equipment from everywhere, motorcycle helmets, lacrosse gloves, like you name it. We kind of used a mishmash, catchers, shin guards from baseball, put them together and basically just sparred. And during that time, I think I taught there for about 2 years. I got to meet Dan a few times and hang out with him privately. I got to meet a good percentage of the Jeet Kune Do full instructors, from Chris Kent, Burton Richardson, Richard Bastillo, Larry Hartzell. Some of them I liked more than others. I liked Larry a lot. He was a very sincere guy, and I trained with him after I opened up SBG and brought him up a couple times. I liked Burton a lot. Burton and I became friends, although he hadn't quite had his revelation about martial arts at the time. I liked Richard Bastillo a lot. Richard Bastillo was very practical. But a lot of what they were doing was bullshit. There's just no other way to put it. And there was a definite hierarchy, and amongst that group, what they were interested in clearly wasn't what I was interested in. I don't want to be too negative about it because it's really easy for me to go down that road. But the most generous thing I can say is they were not interested in fighting. They were interested in collecting certificates and kind of advancing up this hierarchy to see how close you could get to Dan and Asano. And your worth or value was kind of measured that way. And none of them were really fighters. And I would see privately, Dan say things to them like, you need to have a bodyguard or get somebody in here who can fight, so if somebody comes in and gives you a challenge match, they're the ones that do it. And if when they were doing the demonstrations, and the demonstrations were always 1 and 2 step sparring, it was a dead pattern. It's exactly what Bruce Lee was advocating against, was 90% of the training. And if you resisted, or the uki resisted at all, then they'd like hit you in the nuts or do something to try and make it work. And the whole thing was backwards. So as I was there with them, I started to become more and more cynical, and the philosophy that ultimately became the original philosophy, the founding philosophy of SBG, really was a counter philosophy to all the hypocrisy I saw in Jeet Kune Do. And just to give you an example, the big thing was Penjok Silat at the time. And the reason why it was the big thing is because Dan and Asano had a quote in a martial arts magazine: whatever Dan and Asano trained is what they wanted to train. And he started training with a guy named Paul de Torres, who was a pot-bellied guy that wore a funny hat that did goofy martial arts shit. It was kind of like Sistema, honestly. And he had a couple other brothers that also did martial arts. And he came up a couple times. I liked him. He was nice enough. But obviously, to me, it obviously had nothing to do with fighting. And the reason why they were into that is because Dan was doing it, and because Dan had a quote in a martial arts magazine where he said Paul de Torres was the most dangerous man alive. And for that reason, like, they had to learn the secrets of Penjok Silat. And it was obvious to me there were no secrets of Penjok Silat. I think Paul just made that shit up when he got to the United States to teach it to credulous Americans. But I befriended a guy named Stephen Plink, who was Paul's #1 instructor. And they were all kind of in awe of Stephen because he was Paul's #1 instructor. And he was very honest, and he was very sincere, and he was not a phony. He really believed what he did worked. He was also Army Special Forces, so we kind of got along because I had just gotten out of the Army a few years ago. And we became friends. And I would sometimes take his class, but not really. But before the class, was kind of funny, is like you'd have all these guys waiting to learn the next form, because Silat was taught in a series of forms, literally, that you had to memorize. And he would show me like the secret forms and say, how he wasn't going to show it to them, but it was all really silly. I think one of the fighting stances was squatting on the ground with your feet crossed and your arms crossed. Like, if I was going to design the worst way you could possibly defend yourself, I couldn't come up with a goofier way. The kicks were like, if Mr. Bean was making a movie about how to do kicks and it was just a joke, and you're like, what is the most ridiculous way we could possibly try and kick somebody? Okay, let's stand on all fours and kick this way, or let's flip our foot this way because there's actually no biomechanics and it won't hurt anything. That's how they kicked. The whole thing was silly. And the idea was, it was so dangerous you had to shadow spar, which meant you sparred like 8 feet across from each other. So one person would make a move and then you'd be 8 feet away and you'd pretend to counter, right? Mm. So it became really, really silly. And around that time, and I'm terrible with exact time and chronology, it all kind of blends together for me over the years, but somewhere in there, I met Fabio Santos. And that's kind of the story I tell over and over again. My main coach has always been Chris Haueter, but Fabio and Hickson always come up because they were my introduction. What everybody always asks is, how'd you first get introduced to jiu-jitsu? But around that time, I met Fabio. I knew instantly this is what I'm looking for. It was not make-believe. There was no dead patterns. He was like, just try and beat me up. It's a 40-something-year-old man that was about half my weight. And so I started doing jiu-jitsu every single day. I trained with Fabio when I could, which was only a few times, but I got some mats immediately and started trying to work the material. And Stephen Plink was actually interested in that. And eventually he stopped teaching at my friend's school, and started teaching out of his garage, and I would go to his garage and show him some jiu-jitsu, and he'd try and figure it out, because like I said, he was pretty sincere. But it was really after meeting Fabio and seeing jiu-jitsu and then seeing where everything else was going. And I remember being out at a dinner one time with a lot of Inosanto's instructors, and the conversations were always about other people and who wasn't in the clique or who was, and it was always just goofy gossip. It had nothing to do with fighting or training. And there was one guy there who was from Canada, who was one of Dan Inosanto's full instructors from Canada, who then made a point of saying how he was keeping files on those guys. Yeah, I keep a file on those guys, and every time they put something up, an ad, that I put it in their file. And I remember sitting there at the dinner thinking, what the fuck is wrong with you? But as I'm thinking that in my head, I can see that everybody else at the table is like, oh, that's a good idea. You're keeping files. And I knew right at that moment, I'm like, this is not my tribe. These are not my people. For whatever reason, we're just not interested in the same thing. And one of the things I really like talking to you about, and we talked about this when we were in Niagara Falls, is teaching and leadership. And you gave a great leadership talk at the camp in Atlanta last year. Was it last year? No, it's last year, yeah.
It was last year. It was the spring camp.
Spring, yeah.
Yep.
And those are some of my favorite subjects. And those are also a good percentage of the questions we received. But we've got quite a few. So I'm just going to jump right in and go for it.
Fire away. Like I said, be careful what you ask me, because I'll generally answer it.
Well, that's the best part, right? So Dr. John was asking about essential qualities for leadership.
Yeah.
In particular, how you can use those lessons or those qualities in everyday life for just the average person.
Yeah, I think I saw that question. And I think there might have been an aspect of that question. It was, how do you transcend from a professional environment to a personal one? And I spend probably about a third of my year traveling around the world at this point talking about leadership. It's my favorite topic, and I always am very open with the people that I'm talking with that the things that I talk about are not my creation. I mean, it was something that was taught to me generationally through the SEAL community, and the people that taught me, they didn't create it either. It probably goes back, general military leadership principles go back to the times that people picked up sticks and swords and bows and arrows. I mean, it hasn't changed that much. But the amazing thing is that they apply universally, at least in my opinion. There actually is no such thing as military leadership. You have two types and two choices. There's good leadership, which is effective, and then there's bad leadership, which is ineffective. And any title that you put to that, that's, to me, I've always noticed it's a little bit of an excuse. Like, oh, I have to lead this way because I work in this sector. It's like, nah, not really. You can lead effectively and well, or you can't. But beyond, the military is obviously rank driven, as you know. And it's structured. There's a ladder, just like there is in the corporate world. And people often think that if you don't have a leadership position, that you don't have an opportunity to lead. And that's another thing that I always make a point of addressing when I'm speaking publicly is you have an opportunity to lead 24/7, regardless of who you are and what you are doing. Because if you don't have a leadership position, you can always lead by example. And that has to do with how you conduct yourself. And that ties into the question that was asked, the leadership characteristics. And the first one that I think all of them are really, pinned in the ground to is humility. And that's not to say that you shouldn't have an ego, because I think we can all agree that's impossible. And the person that tells you, hey, I don't have an ego, is probably the one you should use with the most caution, because they just told you it's massive.
Right.
But you should have to keep it in check. And you need to keep it from interfacing with your decision-making process. That's the danger of ego. So, if you can be humble, you can be a little bit more objective about who you are, how you're acting, your actions and behaviors on your subordinates or the people around you. If you're not in a leadership position, maybe it's just your friends and family. So it's, humility. Accountability is the next one that we harp on. And that's just the willingness to raise your hand and say, hey, I fucked up. Like, this is on me. And it's so easy to sit there and talk about being accountable. And especially in the world that I came from, it's so hard to stand up in front of your peers that are A-type driven, that have been screened and refined throughout a career, that are high performers, and to raise your hand and be like, yeah, you guys all remember when that sucked? That was my fault. That was on me. But you have to be able to do that. And especially as a leader as well. And, it's very easy to say, when the team is successful, you give your credit to to the team. And when the team fails, as a leader, you step up and you shield them from that, that doesn't mean you don't hold them accountable, but it means that you stand up as the leader and take accountability for the shortcomings. Clear and concise guidance is another characteristic that we focus on. And a lot of that is driven, I think, because we talk on the radio often. We're almost always disaggregate. For me to be in a room with more than one or two people that I'm working with would be pretty abnormal. Mm-hmm. And we could have people all over the place. And the more you talk over a radio, I swear they're designed to work less effectively, the more words that come out of your mouth.
Yeah.
So if you want to rattle off a Steinbeck novel, halfway into that thing, people don't even know what you're talking about. So refining all of your guidance down to something that's clear and concise. And for people in a professional setting, if you go to your people and say, let's sit down and let's talk a bit over coffee, I want you to explain to me what you think the roles and responsibilities of your job are. If they can't give it back to you in a clear and concise manner, then you have work to do from a leadership perspective. Because if your people can't tell you what their job is or the roles and responsibilities of their job, they're probably going to struggle in the execution of that. Mm-hmm. And that one also applies both personally and professionally. The more clear and concise you can be just in your communication with people, the less likely, that there's going to be things that are lost in translation. And then the last one for a characteristic that we screen for in the community when it comes to leadership is control of your emotions. And this is another one where people will think I'm saying be an autonomous robot. And it's actually the opposite of that. I think you have to be we're human beings, right? We're an emotional creature. I think we need our emotions to, it ties into our morality to a degree. But sure. Just like when it comes to humility and ego, you can't let that override your decision-making process. So it's okay to be scared. And when people tell me that they're like, when I was in combat, I was fearless. And it's like, really? Were you? Because it kind of sucks and it's kind of scary. So how about we just say, there's fear present, but instead of allowing the fear to control me, I maintain control of my emotions. And it allows you to objectively work through problems instead of emotionally making decisions. And in my opinion, at least, there's really no benefit to having your emotions tied to your decision-making process. There's no upside, but right. The downside is basically a trapdoor that could be unlimited. So that's, it's a long-winded answer to his question, but it's humility, accountability, clear and concise guidance, and control of your emotions. And that applies personally and professionally. And people, if you want to be a good leader and have a leadership title, the best time to start practicing those things is right now when you're not in that position. Mm-hmm. And then you'll be prepared.
Yeah, it reminds me of what I'm always talking about with jiu-jitsu as it relates to fundamentals. They transcend the environment. These are good rules for everybody, for everything.
Yep. Doesn't matter what you do.
When you were on the job, did you have soldiers that came to you after a combat mission that maybe privately had felt some sense of shame or wondered if they were in the wrong job because they had gotten scared?
It wasn't a lot of the times. Those conversations do happen for sure, but it almost would be, I think they would bottle them a little bit until we got back from overseas. And a lot of those conversations would occur in bars.
Okay.
Strip away a few of the societal layers with about, I don't know, anywhere between 12 to 26 cocktails. I mean, it's amazing the conversations that you can have.
Right.
I never had anybody express that to me overseas. I did have people that would want to come and talk about decisions that they had made, and they were curious as to whether or not they had made the correct decision.
Mm-hmm. What was your answer to people like that generally? I know you have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but somebody that came to you and was expressing, because I used to hear this quite a bit from younger fighters.
Yeah.
That would have their first fight in the cage and then think after that they would feel bad because after that they would still have the same situation where a week prior to the fight they couldn't sleep. And I would just explain to them, it's just your body. It's just natural.
Yeah. When people would come to me, and, I went to people when I was younger as well. Towards the tail end of the career, people are coming to you. And I absolutely went and sought guidance from people when I was younger. And, the first thing, when it came to making decisions, the first thing that I would ask them was to explain the situation to me through the lens of the information they had at the time when they made the decision. Because oftentimes when they were coming to me questioning whether or not they had made a decision. What they were adding to the narrative were things that they did not know in the moment that they had to decide.
Yeah.
And it's, you don't have that much time to make a decision overseas. Sometimes you really do. You can watch people for a long period of time. You can watch them develop their pattern of life, so you can see things that are atypical. And then sometimes you come around a corner and there's somebody standing there, and if you were to have a half of a second to make a decision, that's a really long time. I mean, some of them are just complete rote snapshot decisions based off the information that you have. And so I would always start them with, explain it to me via the information that you had, and then let's look at that, the decision that you made based off the parameters that we are trained to work within, the legal parameters that overlay on top of that. And I never had somebody at the end of that who was questioning at least the morality or legality of their decision, because I found that they were adding things that were external after the fact,
Right.
which it's not a perfect system. People think that war is a scalpel, and it's not. It's probably a rusty, shovel at best. It doesn't cut clean.
How you deal with regular people who don't have a lot of experience with maybe violent conflict, the emotional impact that has on them, having to defend themselves. I think he means both. So someone who maybe would otherwise hesitate to defend themselves and gets put into a situation where maybe they don't even think they're capable of it, how would you talk to them? And I think he's also talking about how would you talk to somebody that had to do it post fact and maybe had a little guilt about it.
Yeah. So that's a good question. And you see some really visceral reactions from people. If you ever see violence out and about, like a fight in a public area or something like that, I don't really watch the people that are fighting because they don't know how to fight, so it's boring. But I'll watch the people around. Like if people are getting into an argument, they're yelling and shouting at each other. If you watch the people around, there's some really strange reactions from people, and you can tell who's not been exposed to violence before or never considered, played the what if game. And that's interesting from a coach's perspective. For us, how do we get people like that to understand they have to go? You've got to start fighting.
What is it when you're watching a crowd that they haven't experienced it before?
Sometimes you'll see people start crying. You'll see like women, sometimes younger girls, and you'll see them. They just start crying. They just freak out. They have nothing to do with the situation. It's just so abnormal and so frightening to them to see violence. You'll see guys who are you'll see them kind of cringing, almost subconsciously, like like that flinching type thing. You'll see that kind of stuff where guys it's one of those things where they just haven't been exposed to it, and to see it just freaks them out, for lack of a better term, and it's interesting to watch, it in the beginning stages, once, if it continues, then they'll kind of get past it, but it's just in that initial, like, holy cow, these guys are going to kill each other moment, type thing. So, I always come back to, in prepping people for those moments, you have to think about what you're fighting for rather than what you're fighting against. So my determination is always to continue to live my life. I've got a good life. I'm thankful for everything I have. My life is very beautiful. It's amazing sometimes. I had there's a joke. Somebody said to me, so I had an opportunity recently to get some stuff from a gun manufacturer, and a guy said, "Oh, it must be nice." And I'm like, kind of is, but it's one of those things where, I think about that kind of stuff. Like, I don't want anybody to take me from that. I don't want anybody or anything to take me from that, because violence isn't always another person. Violence could be a car, it could be a car crash. It could be something just insane happens, and not insane, but just something you never thought of that happens to you, and now you've got to deal with it. And so that kind of stuff, I think about in those moments, that I'm going to live because I love my life. I don't care what it is in front of me. I don't have time to hate them. I don't have time to get mad or rage or anything like that. But you're not taking me from all the things that I love, period. And so that usually connects a little better for folks, especially people that come from a background where they don't have that well of negative experiences. You know, you see one place you'll see these guys, like in the ultra marathon guys, guys that do triathlons and stuff. A lot of times, when I'm training with those guys or training around those guys, I'll talk to a lot of guys that or gals that have dependency things that they overcame, like drug addiction, alcohol addiction, sexual abuse, you know, physical abuse, all that kind of stuff. And they're coming, so they dig into this well of just anger, you know, to suffer, to get through. Cause you know, I'm not planning on running 50 miles unless somebody's chasing me. And, but they're going to run this 50 miles. They dig deep into this well of just hatred and hurt, and just that motivates them and drives them. But for the most part, a lot of people don't have that. And so trying to get somebody like, you got to get mad, you got to rage, like they don't have those experiences. They don't have that to tap into. And the other side of that is you might not want them to tap into that in a training environment, because I'm not a counselor and I'm not a mental health professional. If we do tap into something and open Pandora's box, I can't help them. I just created a problem for them that I can't help. And so I stay away from that side of it and focus completely on what they love. And that comes from one of my friends that does Ironmans, where we talked about it. And I said, hey, you know, Steve, like all these guys are just mad, you know, like I did not expect this, you know? And he goes, yeah, man, it's like that. But I just focus on that, you know, how much I love doing this and how much it's just amazing that I started out with asthma and sick, and now I can bike 70 miles and swim a couple miles and run a marathon all in one day. And like, how awesome is that? And I thought that's a much better approach, you know? And and that kind of altered how I approached self-defense with people, because I kind of was in the middle on that. Like, maybe we need to find a way to get these people mad because they're so timid and so, you know, laid back and just lack exposure to violence. But then I realized, like, what if I tap into, listen, you know, do you like your life? Do you like being able to see your children or your grandchildren? Do you like being able to visit with them and all the things that you do? Do you like that? Do you love that? Well, this person is going to take that from you. You've got to fight. You have got to fight, you know? And so, and then you can kind of, after doing that, then you can slowly kind of ease them into if you don't fight, they're going to get past you and get to all that you love. You're the line in the sand. You have got to stop them. They've got to stop here, you know? And so that's kind of how I do it. And that's worked pretty well for most of my trainees. That really works well. And then for the post stuff, I try to get them to, you know, kind of almost back to like that Byron Katie kind of work thing. Like, is this true? How do you know it's true? You know, it's almost kind of like those questions where they start to have these negative thoughts. Like, man, I can't believe, like, I didn't want to hurt anybody. Like, maybe I shouldn't have, you know, like, and you will have people, and I know you have, you have people that say, maybe I shouldn't have hurt them that bad, or maybe like I shouldn't have gone that far, or maybe they wouldn't have if I just, maybe by me fighting back, it caused it to happen. And you just have to like get through to them. How do you know that's true? You know, is that true? Like, listen, this person has a history of this. You know, if it's a domestic situation or something like that, like they've done this to you before. Like, you have a history with them doing this. So we know that's not true. You know, so so you go through kind of those questions and answers with them where you get them to just kind of answer it for themselves, because they're not going to hear an outside voice. All you can do is guide them. You can't tell them. You just have to guide them into seeing for themselves that what I did in that moment, based on what I knew, was the best thing for me to do. There's 1,000 other ways I could have done it, but right now, in that moment, I did the best that I knew to do. And so once you get them to understand that, then later we can kind of gently begin a more heavy duty debriefing kind of with them, where we go back into, okay, well, at this moment, maybe you could have done this and altered the outcome at this moment. But you can't do that when they're still in that state where they're like second guessing themselves. Yeah. You got to get them past that and then get it into, what can we learn from this? And I try to frame it in, I don't need to learn, you don't need to learn this because you've been through it. But how do I better relay this to others?
Right.
Like if you had to tell someone else.
So you're not laying some guilt on them.
Yeah, for sure. I don't want to do all that work to get the guilt off of them, only to come back and hit them with it, So I want to get them to that place where they can go, okay, well, how would I tell somebody in the future? What are some options? What are some better ways, better things to do? And there's always better ways to do it. And then once you get them in that mind frame where they're looking at it from that perspective, like, hey, how do I pass along these lessons? Because and I tell them, listen, statistically, there's not that many people that are going to experience whatever they experienced, if they experienced violence to that degree where it went physical. So your data point is important, and we need to take the lessons from your data point so that we can pass it on to others, because we don't have enough of this information. And usually you'll see them click, like they get it, like, boom, I am the vessel of knowledge, and they just are like, I can help others. And then that's how I kind of ease them into that, where they have that moment of, oh yeah, okay, so if I were to tell someone else how to do this, this is what I tell them to do.
Yeah.
And then that alleviates the guilt, because they shouldn't feel guilty for defending themselves,
right?
Ever. But I'm telling you, man, good people have a hard time with hurting other people.
Sure.
They really do.